Cops and other law enforcement people of Reddit, what were some cases you worked on that made you think, even if for a moment, that something supernatural or paranormal was going on?
Obligatory not my story, but when I read this, I thought it was pretty disturbing. An elderly lady phoned 911 and requested that they send some policemen down to her house because she saw a shadowy figure lurking in her backyard. She was living by herself at night and didn't feel safe watching someone through her window. When the policemen arrived, the door was unlocked. They walked in and found the lady seated facing the window, and they went to check the backyard. There were no signs of anyone attempting to break in, and nothing was missing. She had very tall fences surrounding her property, making it nearly impossible for anyone to get inside. They did, however, find footprints on the inside of her home. It was quite possible that she had left the door unlocked and wasn't looking outside, but rather at a reflection of someone inside her home, behind her.
Whoever came in saw a nice little house with the door open. As soon as he stepped in, he was greeted by the sight of a frail old woman staring out the back window, silent and still. Judging by the footsteps, it sounds like he left in a hurry.
EMT here. Once I had a call at our local mall. We showed up, and an 8-year-old girl was having trouble breathing. Her mother, aunt, and cousin had just been caught stealing, and it was late at night. We assumed the breathing problem was stress-induced. Once we got into the back of our unit, she looked my partner and me in the eyes and said that she lived in a bad place. She said she lived with demons, and as she described them, her heart rate dropped rapidly from 90 BPM to 45 BPM in a matter of seconds. My partner and I looked at each other and immediately started trying to lighten the mood while preparing for a code. She ended up being okay, but I will never forget that experience. Edit. Once we had her stable, the police were definitely involved. My medic also contacted CPS.
My grandpa was a RIO in Vietnam. Basically, the guy who told the pilot where to go and what was ahead. One day, he and his team were finishing up a mission, and one of his buddies in another jet performed a roll over them. He then descended into the clouds. They never saw him again. He just vanished. They searched for weeks, but there was no crash site, no communications, nothing. Just gone. Edit. For clarification, it was an aerial roll, not a barrel roll. Sorry, I was tired. And they were coming home from a mission. They were over friendly territory when he vanished. They were above the cloud line, so my grandpa is unsure of where exactly they were when he disappeared. This is something I can't explain, and maybe it was just a coincidence. But I've never talked about it with my coworkers. I spent some time as a homicide investigator. We would respond to all apparent self-inflicted deaths and investigate them just to make sure there was no foul play involved. Usually, we found a clear motive or a note explaining the person's state of mind, but sometimes, everything pointed to a self-inflicted case. Yet there was no note and no clear reason why the person would want to end their life. These were people in good health, with steady careers and families who loved them. Still, you can never truly know what someone is going through. Here's the part that really unsettled me. I'd worked maybe 10 cases like this, but the last 3 before I left homicide all had one strange detail in common. A small decorative wicker lighthouse. It was always the same design, painted white and blue. The first time, it stood out because it was right by the bed. 2 weeks later, I saw the same lighthouse again in another case, and even mentioned it to a patrol officer. A few months later, another similar case, and that same lighthouse appeared once more. That's when it hit me that it only showed up in unexplained cases. I went back through photos from older investigations, and in a couple of them, I could see what might have been the same wicker lighthouse, though the angles made it hard to be sure. I don't know what it meant. It could have been nothing more than coincidence, but it gave me chills every time I thought about it. I transferred a few months later and decided to let it go. Edit. That story got more attention than I expected. To answer a few questions, no, I don't believe it was the work of a repeated offender. These were clearly self-inflicted cases, and we treated every single one as if it might be something else, just to be certain. And while repeated offenders are more common than people might think, they rarely leave any kind of calling card like you see in movies. It's usually just someone with a very specific pattern or compulsion. I still believe it was probably an odd coincidence, but it was one of the eeriest patterns I've ever come across.
Not law enforcement, but I am a paramedic firefighter. Late summer night, responding to a call in a rural area. My partner and I were driving down a winding 2-lane highway in the middle of nowhere. No light of any kind other than the headlights and the moon. We were coming up on a sharp right turn when I saw a man moving quickly across the grass from a patch of brush. He was moving very smoothly, almost gliding, like he was riding a bike at high speed, but there was no up and down motion like someone running. I remember thinking how strange it was to see someone out there, in the middle of the night, apparently on a bike. He reached a tree and suddenly stopped. At that exact moment, we were passing by. I looked out the window and saw a man standing next to the tree. No bike, no equipment, nothing, just standing there, silently watching our truck go by. The hair on my neck stood up. We kept driving toward the call, and I asked my partner if he had seen that man. His response was, "Man, I thought I was the only one who saw him." Edit for clarity. He could have been an incredibly fast runner. Or maybe I was just tired and seeing things. What made it so unsettling was how fast he seemed to float across the grass and gravel, how abruptly he stopped, and then the silent stare. I've been doing this for years, and it's the only experience that has ever come close to feeling truly unexplained. Adding to the creepy factor, we were miles away from any house, store, or bar.
I was an EMT for a while. We got a call about someone who was riding their bike at a breakneck speed when they hit a car head first without a helmet. We went over immediately. Despite the fact that it was broad daylight and we were in the middle of suburbia on a Saturday, nobody even came to check on this poor guy. Seriously. The streets were empty. Usually, a massive crowd gathers around violent accidents like this, so his skull was pretty much smashed in and he was unresponsive. It was the worst head injury I'd ever seen. We assessed that he had a major skull fracture, a concussion, and he was bleeding heavily. He was also missing teeth and had a minor road rash, but fortunately, he wasn't missing much skin. To give you an idea of how bad it was, this was the kind of injury that most people don't survive. If you did survive, you'd basically be left in a critical condition. Normally, we would have moved him off the road, but when someone has a head or neck injury, that isn't very safe. My partner, who was also training me as I was still kinda new, went to check his pulse while I began to unload our gear. He crouched down, felt for a pulse for a while, and then stood up and opened his mouth to say something. Suddenly, the guy jumped up. He didn't use his arms to pick himself up. He just suddenly stood up straight. It startled both of us. He looked at us, smiled, and tried to grab his bike. We tried to stop him, but we didn't exactly want to wrestle him to the ground given his condition. He got away from us and bolted into the woods without his bike. My partner was in even more disbelief than I was. He just stared at where the man had run off, mouth open. Then he turned to me and muttered, "He had no pulse, man." I asked him if he was sure, and he swore up and down that the biker was clinically dead. We contacted the authorities for assistance, and they sent a search and rescue team into the forest. I don't know if he was found or not because we normally don't get much information about patients after they go to the professionals. Keep in mind that this was the Pine Barrens, so they had a lot of ground to cover. My best guess is that he went to a loved one's house out of confusion. What I found odd was that head injuries bleed a lot, so you'd think the guy would leave a long red trail of blood for the cops to follow. Sorry. It seems I left out some details. I'm not an EMT anymore. I was only an EMT for about a year. I decided the medical field wasn't for me and switched to pursue computer science. Don't get EMT and paramedic mixed up. We're only taught the basics of first aid and then take a test. It's basically the entry-level job in the medical field, so we can't legally pronounce someone dead. In fact, we almost always leave fatal accidents to the more qualified people. Had this person actually been gone, we wouldn't have done much. I didn't mean this was a fatal accident. The shock wasn't that he suddenly came back to life, but rather that he was alive despite lacking a pulse. The guy was riding his bike very quickly through a suburban area when he struck a parked car. The car was a hatchback, parallel parked on the street. The house the car was parked outside of was, presumably, who called us in. But for whatever reason, people seem to think that you can just call and be done with it. It was a bit strange that nobody seemed to notice the accident, though. I have no idea what happened to the guy. Head injuries usually cause people to become disoriented or uncooperative. But you've got to be very careful with them because moving their head or neck too much can cause serious spinal damage. When he got up, it really took us by surprise. And it didn't help that he moved pretty quickly. As he tried to grab his bike, my partner reached for his arm. He quickly slipped away and ran. We immediately contacted authorities and told them. They arrived. We told them what we knew, and then they sent a small team to find him. I imagine they did find him because he clearly was never reported missing. If he had been, I imagine the news would have picked it up. First responders are rarely given information about a patient after we do our job, so I can't say for sure what happened to him after he ran. I can say with complete confidence that he had no pulse when we found him, but somehow he was still alive.